Okay, by now hopefully you have read over the terms and are becoming more familiar with the elements of a short story. But today I want to discuss how is it that you're going to approach these stories? How is it that you are going to go about reading them and finding the meaning in them? So I want to look at a couple of different stories. One is actually in your book on page 570. Before we consider it, I want you to think about two important ideas. We've talked about how there's value in every sentence in a short story because the writer doesn't have much room to convey his or her meaning. So a short story should be entertaining in every sentence, and it should move the story along in a non-trivial way. So think about that for just a minute. Every single sentence has power. Every single one should have some element to entertain the reader and make you want to go on to the next sentence. And it should also be moving the story along, not in just a minor way, but in an important way, because this meaning has to be packed in these sentences. So let's look at the first story. It's called Hills Like White Elephants, and as I said, it's on page 570 of your textbook. Something else I haven't mentioned is that often the titles tell us something very important about stories. So when you first look at this, you're like, what's this story going to be about? Hills Like White Elephants? Where is it set? I don't understand. But just file that away. Of course you won't understand it right away, but file away the title when you read a story and think about later, why did they call it that? And I think you will be able by the end of the story to understand why this is so significant to the story. So remember what we're looking for, sentences that entertain and push the story along. So I'm just going to start out. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. Okay, so we have a description here. Start visualizing this in your mind. On this side there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station there was the warm shadow of the building, and a curtain made of strings of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. Okay. So we already have a scene. Think about how much information has been packed into that one little paragraph. We know that this couple is sitting outside in a bar. We know that there is quite a bit of contrast between one side and the other. There are these rails that are actually dividing where the area where there's no shade, where they're looking out over to the hills, and then they're actually sitting in the shade of this bar, and we get a description of what it's like. We know there are two people sitting at this table. There is the American and the girl. So we're assuming that the girl is younger, not an American, just from what we have so far. And they're in Spain, and possibly, we don't know yet, possibly they're waiting for a train. They are sitting at the train station. Then, once we get that description, you'll notice that for the rest of this page, or most of it, get a little bit more description here, but for the most of this page, it's entirely dialogue between these two characters. And so they are going to reveal the story to us through their dialogue. It's very simple. You can see it's very short. But again, go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, packed with information. It's pretty hot, the man said. Let's drink beer. Dos cervezas, the man said into the curtain. Big ones? A woman asked from the doorway. Yes, 2 big ones. So here we get a little bit more description. The woman brought 2 glasses of beer and 2 felt pads. She put the felt pads and the beer glasses on the table and looked at the man and the girl. So already, if you ever had a beer on a hot day, you know you need those felt pads because the glass is going to sweat a little bit. So you just get a sense of the heat in this situation. But look what's happening. The girl was looking off at the line of hills. So she's distracted. And then it gives you more information. They were white in the sun and the country was brown and dry. So as I said earlier, you have that contrast between the dark side and the lighter side, the sunny side, the shady side. Now we have this brown countryside and these beautiful white hills. So the girl comments on them. "They look like white elephants," she said. "I've never seen one." The man drank his beer. "No, you wouldn't have." "I might have," the man said. "Just because you say I wouldn't have doesn't prove anything." So look what's happening. Maybe you can relate to this situation where you've been with someone, I don't know, in a bar, at a kitchen table, um, on a park bench, and you're having a conversation, but there's a lot of tension in there, and it has nothing to do with what you're actually talking about. There's some underlying current, there's something that's causing you to have this anxiety between you, and so instead of talking about the thing that's bothering you, you end up talking completely about something else. So what do you want to know when you finish reading this very first page? What is it that they are really upset about? Because we know they're not upset about who knows what about elephants or beer. It's just curious that that seems to be their focus because they can't really talk about. It must be something really serious that they can't just come open with and talk about. Okay, so when you finish a page, you want to consider what is really happening here, and what do I think might happen next? There's a little formula to go through when you're reading these stories. So just read one page of the story, just one, and then consider these things. What do I know so far? Not just about the plot, but mostly about the characters themselves. Which character do I relate to? Maybe there's one you identify with. Maybe there's one you automatically really like or really hate. What do you want to know more about these characters? And then, most importantly, what do you think will happen next? It's sort of a way to put yourself in the situation to think about what would you do if you were the writer, okay? If you can do this at the end of every page, you're going to not get so far in and then think, well, I don't remember. Do this after each page. Then read the next page and repeat these steps. Now what do you know? Now which character is speaking to you and so forth? And now what do you think will happen next? And were you right maybe about what happened? Okay, so let's look at another story. It is not in your textbook, but happens to be a favorite of mine. I haven't read it in quite a long time. So let's remember our steps. First, we want to think about the title. It's called Cathedral. It's by a man named Raymond Carver. And so why Cathedral? Why would that be the name? Again, you don't know that right away. So just file that back in your mind and we'll consider that again when you finish. The story begins. This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. Okay, already I'm thinking in my mind, this seems like an uncomfortable situation. An old friend of someone who's your significant other is coming to spend the night. I think most of us will be a little bit uneasy about that in the beginning, so we're a little bit maybe already feeling for this guy. His wife had died. Okay, so now we know a little bit more why he's coming. So he was visiting the dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. He called my wife from his in-laws. Arrangements were made. He would come by train, a 5-hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. She hadn't seen him since she worked for him one summer in Seattle 10 years ago. All right, so we understand that, you think about the geography, he's been in Connecticut, he has been, which is on the East Coast, he's been completely on the West Coast, so now he thinks he's close enough that he wants to come and visit. But she and the blind man had kept in touch. So it's been 10 years, they've still kept in touch, and he still feels comfortable enough to call her. They made tapes and mailed them back and forth. Now, you may be too young to remember, but used to, there were these things called cassette tapes. I think there's still some around, maybe. And you would record on them and then play them on a machine. And so, obviously, he's blind, so he can't read letters from her. So this is how they communicate. They make these tapes and mail them back and forth. Now, here's the narrator talking again. This is the husband. He was no one I knew. So think about it for a minute. This story is from his point of view. So we're going to look at this through the lens of how the husband sees this situation. And here's another thing about him. And his being blind bothered me. My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing eye dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. So we know something about this character. He's not terribly open-minded. He doesn't like things that are different than him. Probably hasn't been out in the world too much if his only experience with blindness is from the movies, and that's sort of a stereotypical view of the way blind people are. So we're sort of curious to see how he's going to respond to this when we kind of know something about him already. Now, I also want to pay attention to, it just stands out to me right away, that we use a lot of words, I looked for, things that it's just interesting that there are a lot of references to that in a story about a man that happens to be blind that's coming to visit. If we go back to our formula, think about what do you know so far about that's happening in this story? Can you relate to this fella? Do you feel uncomfortable about people who are different than you? What do you want to know more about? Do you want to know more about the relationship between his wife and the blind man? And what do you think is going to happen when he shows up and his wife goes to get this man? Again, this comes down to what are your opinions about the story? Everything in the paper that you're going to write about this story comes from your ideas or is based upon what you think about these particular stories and characters. So as you go, make notes about what you're thinking about them. What do you want to know? What do you understand? And as long as you can find information in the story to help support your opinion, for example, if you want to say that this narrator of the cathedral is closed-minded, as long as you give examples specifically from the story to support you, that's fine. You're welcome to your opinion. That's what makes these stories so interesting, is what we bring to the table and how we transform them through our understanding. But just don't forget that you need to also support your opinions with specific ideas from the story and help the audience of your paper to understand why you feel the way you do about the story.